The morning of July 20th, 1944, began like any other at the Wolfschanz, Hitler's heavily fortified field headquarters deep in the forests of East Prussia. A humid haze hung over the pines, the air thick with the scent of sap and oil. Guards moved through the fog like shadows, their boots crunching on gravel paths. Inside the compound, generators hummed, telephones rang, and stenographers typed under the yellow light of lamps. No one knew that within hours, the fate of millions, and the future course of the war, would hinge on something as ordinary as a wooden table. The conference baroque, known as Barak 3, was a long, narrow building with windows on both sides to let in the summer air. Its heart was a rectangular conference room, bare except for a massive solid oak table that dominated the center. The table had been custom-built for Hitler's staff meetings, heavy, carved from Baltic oak, nearly 10 centimeters thick, its legs broad and reinforced to withstand the weight of maps, instruments, and elbows of generals who leaned in as they argued over troop movements. No one thought much of it. It was just a table, plain, sturdy, German, but it would soon prove stronger than anyone imagined. At precisely 10 a.m., the day's schedule began. Hitler was due to meet with officers from the Army Group Center to discuss the situation on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were tearing through Belarus in Operation Bagration. The Wehrmacht was in crisis. Entire divisions had been encircled. The map that covered the table was filled with red pins creeping westward. Hitler was irritable, exhausted, convinced that only his personal will could hold the collapsing front together. Few dared to contradict him anymore. In another building nearby, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg checked his watch. He had flown in that morning from Berlin, carrying a brown leather briefcase and a folder of papers stamped Geheime Kommandersake, top secret. Inside the case, hidden beneath his documents, was a British-made plastic explosive charge wrapped in brown paper, fitted with a 10-minute acid fuse. It was no larger than a loaf of bread, but powerful enough to kill everyone in the room if placed correctly. Stauffenberg, a tall, aristocratic officer with a black eye patch and missing right hand, adjusted his uniform and steadied himself. He was about to attempt what hundreds had dreamed of and none had dared to finish: the assassination of Adolf Hitler. The conspiracy had been months in the making. Inside Germany, a secret circle of officers and civilians, lawyers, diplomats, generals, had come to believe that the only way to save their country from destruction was to remove the Führer. They called their plan Operation Valkyrie, a contingency originally designed to mobilize reserve troops in case of internal revolt. The conspirators intended to use it to seize control of Berlin and arrest the Nazi leadership once Hitler was dead. The plan was elegant on paper, impossible in practice, unless Stauffenberg succeeded. At 11:45 a.m., he entered the Wolf's Lair, escorted by his aide, Werner von Haeften. The guards saluted. No one searched him thoroughly. He was, after all, a decorated colonel and one of Hitler's favored officers. He passed through 3 security checkpoints and into the central compound, where the July sun glared off the sandbagged roofs. The bomb, armed but not yet activated, was still inside his briefcase. Inside the Baroque, the atmosphere was stifling. Hitler's aides and generals, Keitel, Jadl, Husinger, Bodenschatz, were already gathered around the table, maps spread out before them. A fan whirred in the corner, barely moving the hot air. The meeting had been moved from the underground bunker to the wooden conference hut because of the heat. That decision, made out of simple discomfort, would prove fateful. Underground, the blast would have killed everyone. Above ground, with open windows and solid wood between, it would not. At 12:10, Stauffenberg was ushered into the room. He stood tall, composed, his eye patch giving him a strange, regal air. He saluted sharply. "Heil, mein Führer." Hitler nodded distractedly, his mind already on the Eastern Front. Stauffenberg set his briefcase near the end of the table, close to Hitler's right side, and began laying out his documents. His heart pounded. Beneath the papers, the bomb ticked silently. At 12:30, as the discussion turned to troop reserves, Stauffenberg glanced at his watch. He needed to arm the charge. He excused himself, saying he had to take an urgent phone call. Outside, in a small side room, he and von Haeften worked quickly. With only 3 fingers remaining on his left hand, Stauffenberg struggled to crush the vial that started the acid fuse. The glass snapped with a faint crack. 10 minutes. He slipped the armed explosive back into his briefcase, secured the latches, and returned to the conference room. The air was even hotter now. Hitler leaned over the map, stabbing at it with a pencil, his voice rising in frustration. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase on the floor, just beside the right leg of the heavy oak table, as close to Hitler as possible. "Permission to step outside for a moment, Mein Führer," he said. Hitler waved absently. "Yes, yes, but be quick." At 12:37, Stauffenberg walked out. He passed through the double doors into the sunlight, heart hammering. Each step felt like a lifetime. He and von Haeften moved briskly toward their car. Behind them, through the open windows, voices continued. Laughter. Argument. The sound of chairs scraping against the wooden floor. Then, at 12:42 p.m., the world erupted. The explosion tore through the conference baroque with a roar that shook the forest. The blast shattered windows, ripped apart walls, and sent debris flying hundreds of feet. Guards were thrown to the ground. Smoke billowed from the wreckage, thick and acrid. For a moment, there was only chaos. Screams, confusion, fire. Stauffenberg, hearing the explosion behind him, turned and saw the plume rising above the trees. He saluted quietly. "It is done," he said. "Hitler is dead." But he was wrong. Inside the shattered conference room, amid the wreckage and the ringing in his ears, Adolf Hitler staggered to his feet. His trousers were shredded, his right arm burned, his eardrums ruptured, but he was alive. The blast had been partially deflected by the thick wooden leg of the conference table, which had shielded him from the full force. The briefcase, placed just behind that leg, had also been moved moments before by Colonel Heinz Brandt, who found it in his way and shifted it to the far side. That simple, thoughtless gesture, and the table's dense construction, had absorbed most of the explosion. The oak had splintered but not shattered. It had saved the Führer's life. Others were not so fortunate, for officers lay dead or dying. The walls were pockmarked with shrapnel. The floor was black with blood and smoke. Outside, medics rushed in, tripping over debris. Hitler, trembling but lucid, demanded to see Mussolini, who was due to arrive that afternoon. "He must see that I am alive," he said. "The world must see that I cannot be killed." By 2 p.m., radio reports were already spreading. The Führer has survived an assassination attempt. In Berlin, where the conspirators had begun to mobilize troops under Operation Valkyrie, confusion set in. Without confirmation of Hitler's death, their plan unraveled. Within hours, the Gestapo had arrested the key plotters. By midnight, Klaus von Stauffenberg was dead, executed in the courtyard of the War Ministry, shot by firing squad as he shouted, "Long live sacred Germany!" The wooden table, scorched and splintered, was later photographed by SS technicians and placed in storage as evidence. It would become one of the most infamous pieces of furniture in history, a mute witness to the moment when the war might have ended a year earlier. Many historians would later agree. Had that table been lighter, or had the meeting remained underground, Hitler would have died instantly. The war would have changed overnight. The Allies might have met a Germany already in revolt. Tens of thousands, perhaps millions, might have lived. But the table held. And because it held, the war went on. The explosion at the Wolf's Lair sent shockwaves through more than the East Prussian forest. Within hours, those waves rippled across all of Germany, through army headquarters, ministry offices, and the very corridors of the Reich Chancellery. By dusk, the conspiracy that had taken months to plan was collapsing minute by minute, and Adolf Hitler, shaking with rage and adrenaline, was sitting once again at the same scorched wooden table that had saved his life. The blast had blackened one side of it, the oak splintered like shattered bone, but the frame still stood. Hitler insisted that it remain in place. The officers begged to remove the wreckage, but he refused. "Leave it," he hissed. "Let them see what protects me." His right arm was bandaged, his uniform shredded, but his voice carried an unnatural strength. The table had become, in his mind, proof of divine providence, a sign that fate itself was on his side. That night, he spoke on national radio, his words trembling with fury and conviction. "A tiny clique of ambitious officers has attempted to eliminate me. Our fate is in the hands of Providence. I am alive and unhurt. This proves that nothing can shake the unity of the German nation." Millions listened. To the world, the broadcast was another Nazi propaganda message. To those inside Germany who had secretly hoped the assassination would succeed, it was the sound of despair. The table had saved not just Hitler's life, but his myth. In a regime built on fear and illusion, the idea of his invincibility had been restored in the very hour it should have died. The repercussions were swift and merciless. At midnight, in the courtyard of the Bendler block in Berlin, Klaus von Stauffenberg stood before a wall illuminated by truck headlights. He faced his executioners calmly. "Long live sacred Germany!" he shouted as the rifles fired. His aide, Werner von Haeften, fell beside him, throwing himself into the bullets. Within days, hundreds more were arrested. Generals, officers, civilians, anyone even remotely connected to the resistance. The investigation, led by the Gestapo and Heinrich Himmler's SS, became a purge of the Wehrmacht's soul. Men who had once commanded divisions now found themselves hanging from piano wire in the cellars of Plötzensee prison, their deaths filmed for Hitler's personal viewing. The wooden table, meanwhile, was moved from the conference hut into a storage depot at Rassenburg, catalogued as Evidence, July 20th Incident. Its surface bore deep gouges from the blast, one leg partially shattered but still intact. The irony was unbearable. The same oak that had been meant to support maps of conquest had become the shield of a tyrant. Across Europe, Allied intelligence officers watched the news unfold with grim disbelief. In London, Winston Churchill read the first decrypted reports from the German Foreign Office, intercepted by Bletchley Park within hours of the attempt. The messages were clear. The Führer has survived. Churchill, normally stoic in victory or loss, muttered to his aide, "So, the devil still has his luck." In Washington, Franklin Roosevelt's advisers drew the same conclusion. The war, they realized, would grind on. There would be no internal collapse, no sudden end from within. The only path forward was invasion and unconditional surrender. In that sense, the table at Rassenburg had extended the war for another 9 months. 9 months that would consume tens of thousands more lives in Normandy, the Ardennes, and the ruins of Berlin. Back at the Wolf's Lair, the mood turned darker. Hitler no longer trusted anyone, not even the men who had been at his side for a decade. Every visitor was searched twice. Every officer watched. He had survived countless assassination attempts before, bombs on aircraft, snipers, sabotaged vehicles, but none had come as close as this. The memory of the explosion haunted him. The sound of the blast echoed in his mind, yet he interpreted it not as a warning, but as confirmation of his destiny. "I am protected by Providence," he told Goebbels. Nothing can destroy me until my mission is complete. It was a dangerous kind of faith. The table's survival had become a religious relic of his delusion. The propaganda machine wasted no time. Within 48 hours, photographs of the destroyed conference room appeared in German newspapers. Captions read, "The Führer's miraculous escape." In one image, the charred remains of the oak table stood amid wreckage, the grain of the wood burned black, the floor beneath covered in ash. The image was meant to inspire awe. It worked. Across the Reich, civilians whispered that Hitler had been saved by fate, by some supernatural shield. Even in defeat, his myth deepened. But for the conspirators who survived, the table became a symbol of unbearable irony, proof that history can hinge on the smallest material accident. In prison cells, men like General Ludwig Beck and Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben faced their executions with the knowledge that their nation's chance for redemption had been undone by the thickness of oak and the placement of a single leg. Months later, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from east and west, the Wolf's Lair was abandoned. In November 1944, under orders from Himmler, the SS detonated hundreds of charges to destroy the complex. The blast reduced the bunkers to rubble, but the ruins of the conference hut and fragments of that table remained buried under ice and ash. Soviet troops found them the following winter, a blackened leg, a splintered edge of wood. They were photographed, then forgotten, lost among the debris of a collapsing empire. The war continued into 1945, with every front bleeding. The Allied landings in Normandy had turned into the liberation of France. The Red Army was pushing toward the Oder. Yet inside the bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler still believed in his destiny. The table's survival at Rassenburg had convinced him that he was chosen, indestructible. Even as the shells fell on the city in April, he told his generals, "I have been saved before. I will be saved again." But this time, there was no table. When he finally took his own life on April 30th, 1945, the world he had built collapsed with him. His body burned in a shallow crater behind the Reich Chancellery, and the myth of divine protection died with the smoke. In the years that followed, historians would pore over every detail of the July 20th plot. They examined the bomb's design, the placement of the briefcase, the physics of the explosion. They concluded that had the meeting remained in the concrete bunker, or had the table been made of metal rather than oak, Hitler would have been killed instantly. The war might have ended in the summer of 1944, sparing millions of lives. But history does not move on, might have. It moves on what is, and what is, sometimes, turns on something as simple as the grain of wood. Today, a single surviving fragment of that table is displayed in the German Resistance Memorial Center in Berlin. It is unremarkable, a scorched piece of oak, cracked and blackened. Visitors walk past it, barely noticing. But those who pause long enough to read the placard understand what they are looking at, the object that stood between life and death, peace and another year of war. The caption reads simply, "Fragment of conference table, Wolfschanz, July 20th, 1944. No mention of destiny, no mention of fate. Just wood, silent, indifferent, immortal." And yet, that wood changed everything. In the decades that followed the war, the story of the wooden table at the Wolf's Lair became one of the most haunting symbols in modern history, a reminder that fate often hides in the mundane. Historians, engineers, and survivors alike returned to that single afternoon in July 1944, studying the smallest details, searching for the point where chance had decided the world's direction. It wasn't a great army, or a secret weapon, or a diplomatic maneuver that saved Adolf Hitler that day. It was a table, built by an anonymous carpenter years earlier, meant only to hold maps and teacups. When the Allies occupied Germany in 1945, the ruins of the Wolfschanz lay deep in Soviet territory. The Red Army sent engineers to survey what was left of Hitler's wartime headquarters. Most of the compound had been destroyed when the SS detonated explosives during their retreat. The once secret fortress was reduced to a wasteland of shattered concrete and moss-covered bunkers. Among the rubble of Baroque III, they found the remains of that table, blackened fragments of oak, bolts twisted from the blast, and splinters embedded in the floorboards. The Soviets documented everything with photographs and stored the pieces in crates labeled evidence. Führer headquarters. Then, like so many relics of the war, the fragments vanished into archives and silence. 4 years, the story of the table lived mostly in memory, whispered among veterans, mentioned in passing in post-war trials. But as Germany rebuilt itself in the 1950s, a new generation began to ask questions. Who were the men who had tried to kill Hitler? Why had they failed? And how could something as simple as a wooden conference table decide the fate of an entire continent? In 1954, 10 years after the attempt, a journalist named Rudolf Peckel, who had been imprisoned by the Gestapo for his involvement in conservative resistance circles, published an article in Die Zeit titled Das Brett des Schicksals, the Board of Fate. In it, he described visiting the ruins of the Wolf's Lair, standing where the conference hut had once stood. He wrote, "The forest has reclaimed the ground. The wind moves through the pines as it did that day. But under the moss and ash lies the wood that decided a million fates. No monument marks it, but its silence speaks louder than marble." His words reignited public curiosity. Survivors of the July 20th conspiracy, men like Ewald von Kleistschmenzen and Ulrich von Hassel, had been executed, but others, like General Fabian von Schlabrendorff, who miraculously survived a Gestapo interrogation, began to speak publicly. Schlabrendorff, in his 1946 book They Almost Killed Hitler, described the table as the final conspirator, a passive participant that unknowingly defeated the men who sought to save Germany from ruin. The phrase stuck. Historians repeated it, and soon the table itself became a paradoxical symbol, both savior and curse. Through the 1960s and 70s, as the world confronted the moral aftermath of the war, filmmakers and historians revisited the plot in growing detail. In 1951, the film The Desert Fox briefly depicted the aftermath of the bombing. Later, in 1971, Joe Bayer's documentary Operation Walkure reconstructed the event with chilling precision, using measurements from declassified German and Allied reports. Engineers demonstrated how the blast wave had been diverted by the thick oak leg of the table, the same leg that had shielded Hitler's body from the pressure of the explosion. They calculated that the solid wood had reduced the lethal overpressure by nearly 60%. The conclusion was unavoidable. Physics had preserved dictatorship. One of the surviving engineers who reconstructed the table, Dr. Wilhelm Hahn, told a historian in 1974, "It was not destiny. It was craftsmanship." The carpenter who built that table used high-density oak, the kind used in fortress doors. He never knew he was saving a tyrant's life. That carpenter's name has never been found. But somewhere, decades before the war, he had selected a tree from a Baltic forest, cut it into boards, planed its edges, and built a table strong enough to bear the weight of Hitler's empire, and strong enough to survive its attempted destruction. In Berlin, the memory of July 20th became both wound and warning. Each year, ceremonies were held in the courtyard of the Bendler block, where Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators had been executed. Wreaths were laid beneath the bronze statue of a bound soldier, the memorial to German resistance. Among the objects displayed inside the adjacent museum was a single piece of blackened oak recovered from the Wolf's Lair, labeled simply, "Fragment of table from Hitler's headquarters, Rassenburg, July 20th, 1944. Visitors would often pass by it without realizing its meaning, until they read the inscription below. This table stood between life and death, tyranny and deliverance. The object's simplicity gave it power. It was no monument of marble or bronze, just burned wood. Yet it represented everything about the strange, cruel logic of history. How survival can depend not on courage or intent, but on coincidence. In academic circles, the July 20th attempt became one of the most studied moments of the war. The Bundesarchiv, Germany's federal archive, released declassified photographs showing the aftermath of the blast. One picture, taken by an SS photographer within hours of the explosion, shows the table's remains, the center blown apart, one leg split, yet still upright. Around it lie fragments of chairs, papers, and the shattered glass of maps. The caption reads, Führerbesprechung 20 Juli, 1242 Uhr, Zerstorter Besprechungstisch. It is one of the most chilling images of the war, the ghost of a room where history hesitated. By the late 20th century, scholars had calculated the hypothetical outcomes had Hitler died that day. The conspirators' plan, Operation Valkyrie, would have immediately declared martial law under the pretext of suppressing an SS coup. Reserve army units would have taken control of Berlin, arrested the Nazi leadership, and opened negotiations with the Western Allies. The Eastern Front might still have collapsed, but the war in the West could have ended within weeks. Instead, Hitler's survival unleashed a wave of terror that silenced all remaining dissent. Thousands of suspected sympathizers were executed. The resistance inside Germany died that summer. And all because of one wooden table. In 2008, when the film Valkyrie introduced a new generation to the story, the production team traveled to the actual ruins of the Wolf's Lair to film scenes. Deep in the Polish forest, they found the remnants still there, concrete walls overtaken by moss, twisted rebar emerging like veins. The conference room site was marked by a simple plaque. The guide, an elderly Polish historian named Andrzej Przewozny, told them quietly, the table was oak, German oak, thick enough to stop a bomb. He smiled faintly. Some say it was luck. Others say it was fate. But I think it was just wood doing what wood does, holding firm. Today, visitors still walk those same paths, past the crumbling bunkers and rusted wire. The air smells of pine and damp soil. You can still trace the outline of the conference hut, the spot where the table once stood. Nothing remains of the structure, only the faint impression of foundation stones. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the murmur of generals, the scratch of pencils, the ticking of watches, and then the explosion that almost changed the world. And somewhere in that silence, the ghost of that wooden table endures, a mute witness, a reminder that history, for all its grand armies and ideologies, sometimes turns on the smallest, most unassuming things, a misplaced briefcase, a man's thoughtless gesture, a carpenter's choice of timber. The war could have ended that day, but the table held, and because it did, the world burned for 1 year more. After the smoke of war cleared and Germany lay divided between East and West, the story of the wooden table lingered like a whisper, never forgotten, never fully understood. In the bombed-out ruins of Berlin, people spoke of it in hushed tones, the table that saved Hitler. For some, it was cursed. For others, it was fate made tangible. And for historians, it became one of the most perplexing relics of the entire war, a piece of furniture that changed the moral and physical trajectory of Europe. In the first years after the war, the Allies treated the July 20th conspiracy cautiously. The Cold War was already beginning to draw new lines, and the Western powers were hesitant to glorify German officers, even those who had turned against Hitler. For them, the war had been won by the Allied armies, not by resistance from within the Reich. In the Soviet zone, the story was even more distorted. Communist propaganda painted the conspirators not as heroes, but as aristocrats trying to preserve their class power. As a result, for nearly 20 years, the world remembered Stauffenberg's bomb, but not the table that had stopped it. That changed in 1955, when West Germany regained partial sovereignty. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer sought to re-establish national dignity, and part of that effort included recognizing the courage of those who had resisted Hitler. The July 20th plotters were officially honored as patriots. Memorials were erected, ceremonies established, and at the center of every retelling, every reconstruction of that day, stood the same simple object, the wooden conference table. In 1956, the German government commissioned a technical study of the Wolf's Lair bombing for historical preservation. The investigators traveled to Rassenburg, by then part of Poland, renamed Ketrazin, to locate surviving remnants. They found fragments of the table buried in the soil near the former barracks site, blackened but unmistakable. A local villager had salvaged a large piece of oak from the ruins and used it to repair the door of his shed. When historians examined it, they found embedded metal shrapnel from the July 20th explosion. The fragment was later transferred to Berlin, where it became part of the archives of the German Resistance Memorial Center. It remains there to this day, scarred but intact, a relic of survival. The scientific report that followed confirmed what witnesses had long claimed. The table was made from solid Baltic oak, nearly 8 centimeters thick, with reinforced legs. The briefcase containing the bomb had been placed on the floor, leaning against the central table leg closest to Hitler. When Colonel Heinz Brandt moved the briefcase to the other side, the thick wooden panel and leg absorbed the majority of the blast wave. The difference in placement, less than 1 meter, determined who lived and who died. The explosion's energy expanded outward and upward, shattering windows and blowing apart the ceiling. But the table's dents would deflected the core of the pressure wave downward and away from Hitler's body. One physicist who examined the evidence later remarked, "If the table had been made of hollow steel, the blast would have rebounded. If it had been lighter pine, it would have disintegrated. But oak held just long enough." That sentence, "oak held just long enough," became the quiet epitaph of the entire event. In the following decades, the story of the table evolved into something larger than an artifact. It became a metaphor for how history resists intention, how the smallest variables can overturn the greatest acts of courage. Every July 20th, at exactly 12:42 p.m., the time of the explosion, the Bendlerblock Memorial in Berlin holds a moment of silence. Officials and soldiers stand in the courtyard where Stauffenberg fell, while schoolchildren read the names of those executed in the aftermath. Behind glass inside the museum, a single piece of oak is displayed beside the conspirators' photographs. Some visitors bow, others simply stare at the wood grain, wondering how it could carry so much weight. In 1970, the writer Joachim Fest published Stottstreich, De Lang Weg zum 20. Julie, State Coup, The Long Road to July 20th. Fest wrote that the table was the dumbest villain in history, a symbol of both the resistance's tragedy and Hitler's monstrous luck. He argued that the table, and the briefcase moved beside it, were perfect metaphors for the moral chaos of the war. Chance is the only god that still ruled in July 1944. Fest's book became a cornerstone of post-war reflection. Readers, both German and international, found themselves haunted not just by the conspiracy, but by its physical setting. The wooden table, humble and unfeeling, had become the line dividing salvation and catastrophe. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunited, the story took on new meaning. A nation long divided by ideology found a strange unity in acknowledging its complex past, both the crimes of the regime and the courage of those who resisted it. Television documentaries revisited the assassination attempt in detail. Engineers at Munich University even constructed a full-scale model of the Wolf's Lair conference room, using original blueprints and blast physics to simulate the event. Their conclusion was chilling. Had the briefcase remained on the Führer's right side, the lethal overpressure would have exceeded 400 psi, instantly fatal. It hadn't. It had been moved behind a thick leg of oak. That single movement, That single moment prolonged the war by 282 days. In that time, the Allies would cross the Rhine, the Red Army would storm Berlin, and millions more would die. Soldiers, civilians, prisoners, children. The difference between peace and another year of slaughter had been measured in centimeters. By the 21st century, the tale of the wooden table had entered the canon of historical what-ifs. Universities taught it as a case study in contingency, how history, despite its vast structures and ideologies, can hinge on the smallest accident. Documentaries around the world repeated the same haunting conclusion. If not for the table, Hitler would have died, and the war might have ended 9 months sooner. In 2004, the fragment preserved in Berlin was moved to a new permanent exhibit titled Courage and Consequence, the German Resistance 1933 to 1945. Beneath the oak, etched in brass, are the words, "A piece of the table from the Führer's headquarters, Rassenburg." The bomb exploded at 12:42 p.m., July 20th, 1944. 4 men died. Adolf Hitler lived. History turned. Visitors stand quietly before it. There is no dramatization, no sound, just silence. The surface of the wood is still rough to the touch, its grain warped by heat. It looks like any other table fragment in any other museum, until you remember what it did, or rather, what it prevented. And so the table endures as one of history's cruelest relics, not a monument to invention or victory, but to chance. It teaches a lesson that no textbook can fully explain, that the fate of nations can rest not only in the minds of men, but in the material world, in the wayward splinters, in the placement of a chair, in the unnoticed physics of an ordinary room. Each July 20th, as the bells ring across Berlin in remembrance, the oak remains still and silent in its glass case. And perhaps somewhere, the ghost of that room, the heat, the papers, the sound of boots and breath before the blast, lingers in the grain of the wood. A table that changed nothing. A table that changed everything. Today, almost 80 years after that July afternoon, the wooden table from the Wolf's Lair has become more than a relic. It has become a lesson, a silent teacher of the randomness that defines history. It rests behind glass in Berlin, small and unassuming, its surface blackened by fire. School groups walk past it each week. Tourists glance at it, puzzled, until they read the words on the plaque. Only then do they stop, their faces changing as the weight of what they're looking at sinks in. The guide's voice echoes softly through the memorial hall. "This is a piece of the table that saved Adolf Hitler's life," she says. There is always a pause after that sentence. It lands like a blow. Because in that pause, everyone begins to imagine the alternative. A world where that table splintered cleanly under the force of the explosion, where the bomb's pressure wasn't diverted, where the meeting room became a tomb. That world would have looked very different. The German resistance, brief and desperate as it was, might have succeeded in seizing control of Berlin. The surviving conspirators planned to form a provisional government under General Ludwig Beck, negotiating peace with the Western Allies while surrendering to the Soviets in the East. Tens of thousands of Jews, prisoners, and civilians might have been spared the last year of extermination and fire. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo might have remained standing. Europe's borders might have shifted less violently. But history doesn't deal in might-have-beens. It deals in what is. And what is that a thick oak table stood between the world and peace. For historians, the table is one of the most vivid reminders that the great arcs of history are often broken or redirected by material accident. It reminds us that human intention, even courage, even righteousness, must still contend with the world's indifference. That 1,000 acts of bravery can crumble before one stroke of chance. It is not cynicism to say this. It is humility. In universities, philosophy professors use the story of the table as a parable of contingency, the idea that history is not inevitable, but built from fragile intersections of will and coincidence. One professor at Heidelberg once began his lecture on moral courage by holding up a photograph of the burned table leg. "This," he told his students, "is why good must act, even knowing it can fail. Because sometimes fate sides with wood." In the decades after reunification, Germany's relationship to the memory of July 20th deepened. The conspirators, once branded traitors, are now honored as men of conscience. Streets and schools bear their names. Each year, the German army holds its oath-taking ceremony for new recruits in the Bendler Block courtyard, under the bronze figure of the bound soldier. The act is both symbolic and solemn, an oath not to obey blindly, but to serve conscience before command. When the ceremony ends, officers and cadets file through the museum, stopping before the fragment of oak. The young soldiers stand silently, realizing that everything they are sworn to do, to act with moral courage, to resist tyranny, was once attempted in that same spirit and stopped by the simplest of barriers. The table also found its way into literature and art. In 1999, German sculptor Anselm Kiefer created an installation titled Der Tisch des Schicksals, the Table of Fate, a massive slab of charred oak suspended in midair by invisible cables. Beneath it lay shards of glass and ash, representing the fragility of ideals. Kiefer said in an interview, "I wanted to show how history hangs above us, heavy, ordinary, indifferent. That table is not just about Hitler surviving. It is about every time chance decides for us." Over time, the table's meaning expanded beyond Germany. In Poland, at the site of the Wolf's Lair, visitors can still walk the moss-covered ruins where the explosion happened. The air smells of resin and damp soil. The bunker walls are cracked but still standing, their concrete thick with roots. A simple plaque stands where the conference hut once stood. Here, on July 20th, 1944, a group of German officers tried to end the war. The bomb exploded at 12:42 p.m. The Führer survived. Nothing else is said. The forest speaks louder than any inscription could. In the late afternoon light, when the sun filters through the pines, the clearing seems frozen in time. You can almost hear it, the murmur of voices, the scrape of chairs, the flick of a lighter, the sound of breath before the detonation. The echo of that moment lingers in the air. Every gust of wind through the trees sounds like history sighing. Historians now agree that July 20th, 1944, was the last real chance to end the Third Reich from within. Everything that followed, the Ardennes offensive, the destruction of Berlin, the deaths of millions in camps and on battlefields, came after the failure of that single day. And while the table itself did not choose to save Hitler, its existence became a symbol of how fragile salvation can be. The resistance was brave. The plan was sound. But wood and luck intervened. The table's survival reminds us of something deeper than coincidence. It reminds us that objects carry the memory of human events, that things we build, touch, or ignore become silent witnesses to the best and worst of us. The oak that once grew tall in a Baltic forest became part of a tragedy it could never comprehend. Yet it endures, long after the voices and empires around it have faded. In Berlin, as night falls, the museum grows quiet. The halls empty, the lights dim. The fragment of the table sits alone, illuminated by a single beam. Its charred surface gleams faintly under the glass. Somewhere in the grain, the heat of that July day still seems to hum. It is only wood, heavy, rough, lifeless. And yet, in that wood, one can feel the vibration of a world that came within inches of changing forever. A table that saved a dictator. A table that condemned millions. A table that reminds us that history is not written by destiny, but by detail. And that sometimes, when fate hesitates, the smallest thing in the room decides.